On that brutal February night, when breath turned to ice before it left your lips, Victoria Kensington was just an ordinary waitress, locking up Sal's diner after the late shift. She never imagined that the faint whimper coming from behind the dumpster would shatter the careful walls she'd spent 26 years building around her heart. A child was huddled there in the freezing darkness. Her designer coat was torn to ribbons. Her light brown hair was matted with snow. Her lips had turned blue from the cold. But it was her eyes that stopped Victoria's heart. Huge, terrified eyes in a face too thin, too pale. Eyes that had witnessed things no 6-year-old should ever see. "Please," the little girl whispered through chattering teeth, "don't call police. Bad men. Everywhere." Victoria brought her inside. She wrapped her in blankets. She fed her warm soup with trembling hands. She thought she was only doing what any decent person would do, saving a freezing child from certain death. But the next morning, 5 gleaming black SUVs stopped in front of her run-down studio apartment. A man stepped out, tall and imposing, in an expensive suit, dark hair slicked back, olive-tanned skin, and eyes like cut glass. Around him moved an armed security detail, their weapons barely concealed. He was Enzo Russo, the most feared mafia boss in the city, and the child Victoria had saved the night before, little Zadie, was his daughter. Enzo looked at Victoria with those cold, calculating eyes. Then he declared something that left her frozen in place. Under an ancient law of the Russo family, the one who saves his child's life belongs to his family forever. From that moment on, Victoria's quiet life was over. She was no longer an invisible waitress living paycheck to paycheck. Now she belonged to a world of luxury and violence, of armed guards and deadly secrets, of men who killed without hesitation, and a little girl who hadn't spoken a word since her mother's death. But the one thing Victoria never expected most of all was this: her heart would end up belonging to that dangerous man, and she would discover that sometimes family isn't the one you're born into, it's the one that claims you when you least expect it. If you want to know how Victoria survived in Enzo Russo's world and how a waitress with nothing became the heart of a mafia family, please leave a like on this video. Share this story with anyone who loves emotional, gripping tales, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the most powerful stories every day. But to understand why that freezing February night changed Victoria Kensington's life forever, we need to turn back the clock. We need to return to the painful past she'd been trying to outrun for the last 26 years. Victoria hadn't always been alone. There was a brief moment in her life, though she could barely remember it, when someone had wanted her. Her biological mother, whoever she was, had carried her for 9 months. But on a cold morning in November, that same mother had wrapped her newborn daughter in a thin hospital blanket, walked into Boston General's emergency room, and simply left. No name, no note, just a baby girl with dark hair and eyes that would later turn hazel, abandoned on a plastic chair in the waiting room. The nurses found her 3 minutes later, crying with hunger, her tiny fists clenched against a world that had already rejected her. They named her Victoria, a name that meant victory, though she would spend the next 2 decades wondering what exactly she was supposed to have won. From that hospital waiting room, Victoria entered the Massachusetts foster care system, and for the next 18 years, she learned what it truly meant to be unwanted. Her first foster home, when she was 3 months old, sent her back after 6 weeks. The report said she cried too much at night. The second family kept her until she was 2, then returned her when the wife got pregnant with a biological child. They no longer had room for someone else's daughter. The third home, the fourth, the fifth. Victoria lost count of how many times she'd been packed into a social worker's car with her belongings in a trash bag, driven to a new house, and told to smile and be grateful. By the time she was 7, Victoria had learned to stop unpacking completely. She kept her few possessions, a stuffed rabbit with one eye missing, 3 books from the library, and the worn hospital blanket she'd been found in a backpack under her bed, ready to leave at a moment's notice. She learned that forever family was a lie social workers told to make foster kids feel better. She learned that no matter how good she was, how quiet, how helpful, how invisible she made herself, she would eventually be sent away, because that's what always happened to girls like her. At 11, she was placed with the Hendersons, a couple in their 50s who seemed kind at first. Mrs. Henderson baked cookies, Mr. Henderson coached Little League. For 3 months, Victoria let herself hope. She even started calling them Mom and Dad like they'd asked her to. Then their adult son lost his job and moved back home with his own 2 children. Victoria was sent back to the group home. No warning, no explanation beyond, it's just not working out anymore. She was 11 years old, and she was learning that love was conditional, that belonging was temporary, that she, fundamentally, was disposable. The group home on Ashmont Street became her longest placement, 4 years from age 12 to 16. It wasn't a home. It was a warehouse for unwanted children, a place where 40 kids fought over bathroom time, where your belongings got stolen if you didn't sleep with your backpack under your head, where the staff were overworked and underpaid and had stopped caring about individual children years ago. She learned to fight there. Not with her fists, she was too small for that, but with her will. She learned to go days barely speaking, to make herself so unremarkable that people forgot she was in the room. She learned to survive on almost nothing, to stretch a dollar until it screamed, to fix her own clothes with needle and thread from the dollar store. At 16, one final foster family took her in, the Kowalskis, an older couple who'd never had children. For 2 years, Victoria lived in their quiet house in Dorchester. They weren't warm people. There were no hugs, no I love yous, no birthday celebrations, but they were stable. They fed her, they left her alone, and when Victoria turned 18 and aged out of the system, Mrs. Kowalski helped her apply for student loans and find her first apartment. It wasn't love, but it was the closest Victoria had ever come. On her 18th birthday, Victoria received her official discharge from DCF, the Department of Children and Families. She was given a garbage bag with her belongings, $500 in transition assistance, and a photocopied packet of information about community resources. No one came to her high school graduation 3 weeks later. She sat alone in the bleachers afterward, watching other families take photos, and realized with stunning clarity that this was her life. This was all it would ever be. She was alone. She had always been alone, and she would die alone. For the next 8 years, Victoria built a life around that truth. She worked 2 jobs, sometimes 3. She rented the cheapest apartments she could find, places with broken heaters and cockroaches and neighbors who screamed through the walls at 3 a.m. She saved every penny she could, not for anything specific, just for the security of knowing she could survive another month. She never let anyone get close. She went on exactly 3 dates in 8 years and ended all of them after one evening, because the moment someone started asking personal questions about her family, her past, her dreams, Victoria felt her chest tighten with panic. She'd learned the hard way that connection meant eventual abandonment, and she'd had enough abandonment for one lifetime. By the time she was 26, Victoria Kensington had perfected the art of being invisible. She was the waitress people didn't remember, the neighbor who never made noise, the woman who existed in the margins of other people's lives. She told herself she preferred it that way. She told herself she didn't need anyone. She told herself so many lies just to survive each day. And then came that February night, the night everything changed. Now, at 26, Victoria lived in a cramped studio apartment above a laundromat in South Boston. The smell of industrial detergent seeped through the floorboards. The radiator clanked and hissed but barely produced heat. The single window had a crack sealed with duct tape that let frigid air whistle through every night. The bathroom was so small she had to stand sideways to close the door. Her bed was a futon she'd found on the curb and disinfected 3 times. Her kitchen consisted of a hot plate, a mini fridge, and a microwave from 1997. But it was hers. She paid $650 a month for it, nearly half her income, and every payment felt like proof she could survive. She worked at Sal's Diner, a roadside place 40 minutes outside Boston, where truckers and highway workers stopped for coffee and greasy breakfasts. The pay was terrible, $2.63 an hour plus tips, but Sal was a decent boss who didn't ask questions and paid her in cash when she needed it. She worked the late shift, 2 p.m. to 11 p.m., 5 days a week. Victoria had no close friends. The other waitresses were nice enough, but they had families, boyfriends, lives that didn't include a damaged foster kid who couldn't talk about her childhood without shutting down. She'd grown so used to loneliness that it had become like breathing, something she did without thinking, something she no longer questioned. And for 26 years, Victoria Kensington had never known what it felt like to truly belong anywhere. Not until that blizzard night. That night when everything changed. That night when a freezing child and a dangerous man would teach her that family isn't always blood. Sometimes it's choice. That particular February night, the blizzard descended on Boston like nature's fury. Snow fell so thick Victoria couldn't see 10 feet beyond the diner's windows. The wind howled and shrieked, rattling the glass in its frames. The highway was nearly deserted, only the occasional truck crawling past, headlights barely penetrating the white void. Sal's Diner, sitting alone by the roadside like a beacon of warm light in the storm, had closed early. The last customer, a trucker named Pete who always ordered the meatloaf, had left around 9 p.m., shaking his head and muttering about the crazy weather. Sal had told her, pulling on his heavy winter coat. He was in his 60s, with kind eyes and a salt and pepper beard. "This storm's a bad one. You get home safe, all right? Don't stay too late cleaning." Victoria had nodded, watching Sal push through the door into the howling wind. Then she was alone with the hum of the refrigerator and the distant wail of the storm. She went through her closing routine on autopilot, wiping down tables, stacking chairs, checking that the stove was off, taking out the trash. The routine was so familiar she could do it in her sleep. Her mind drifted to her tiny apartment, to the cup of instant ramen waiting in her cupboard, to the thin blanket she'd pile on her bed to fight the cold. No one was waiting for her there. No one would ask if she'd eaten dinner or made it home safely. Just the familiar silence and the rhythmic thumping of the laundromat's dryers below. Close to 11 p.m., Victoria had finished everything. She reached for the light switch when she heard it. A sound. Faint, almost swallowed by the wind. A whimper. Victoria froze, her hand hovering over the switch. She listened. Maybe it was just the wind or a piece of loose metal banging against the dumpster outside. Maybe it was nothing. But something about that sound made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. It hadn't sounded like wind. It had sounded alive. Hurt. Every instinct screamed at her to ignore it, lock up, go home. Whatever was out there wasn't her problem. On a night like this, in a storm like this, no sane person went outside to investigate strange noises. But Victoria Kensington had spent her entire childhood being the strange noise that everyone ignored. She'd been the whimper in the dark that no one came to check on. And maybe that was why, against all logic and self-preservation, she grabbed the flashlight from under the register and headed for the back door. The cold hit her like a physical blow. The wind tore at her thin work jacket and sent snow stinging into her face. Victoria swept the flashlight beam through the darkness, squinting against the blinding white. Nothing. just the hulking shadows of the dumpsters and the endless swirl of snow. She was about to turn back when the light caught something on the ground. Dark drops against the white snow. Blood. Fresh enough that it hadn't frozen yet, forming a trail that led behind the largest dumpster. Victoria's heart began to hammer. She should go back inside, call 911, let professionals handle whatever this was. But her feet were already carrying her forward, following that trail of blood, the flashlight beam cutting through the storm. When she reached the dumpster and swept the light behind it, Victoria saw something that made her heart stop. A child. A little girl, maybe 6 years old, huddled against the brick wall. Her expensive coat, designer, the kind Victoria had only seen in store windows, was torn and filthy. Her light brown hair was plastered to her face with melting snow. Her lips were blue. But it was her eyes that broke something inside Victoria's chest. Huge, dark eyes in a face too thin, too pale, filled with a terror so pure it transcended language. "Please," the child whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Don't call police. Bad men everywhere." Victoria dropped to her knees in the snow, not feeling the cold, not feeling anything except the urgent need to help this child. She shrugged off her own jacket, leaving herself in just her thin work uniform, and wrapped it around the shivering girl. "I've got you," Victoria heard herself say, her voice surprisingly steady. "I won't let anyone hurt you. What's your name, sweetheart?" The child stared at her for a long moment, as if weighing whether to trust this stranger. Her lips were trembling so badly she could barely form words. Zadie," she finally whispered. "Okay, Zadie. I'm Victoria. Can you walk? We need to get you inside where it's warm." The girl nodded, but when she tried to stand, her legs buckled. Victoria caught her, shocked at how light she was, how fragile. This child was starving. Victoria could feel every rib through the torn coat. Victoria lifted Zadie into her arms, feeling the girl's frozen fingers clutch desperately at her shirt. She carried her through the howling storm, back through the door, into the blessed warmth of the diner. Inside, Victoria set Zadie gently in the corner booth, the one farthest from the windows, and cranked up the heat. The child was shaking so violently, Victoria worried she might be going into shock. "Zadie, I need to call someone. You need a doctor. You're freezing and—" "No!" The word came out with surprising force. Zadie's eyes went wide with panic. "No police, no hospital. Bad men have people everywhere. They'll find me. They'll—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Tears started rolling down her cheeks. Victoria crouched in front of her, taking the child's frozen hands in her own. Okay, I won't call anyone right now, but you need to warm up. Can you tell me what happened?" Zadie's voice came out in broken whispers. "Men took me from school. Said Papa sent them, but they were lying. Put me in a van. I jumped out when they stopped. Ran. Got lost in the snow. So cold. Couldn't find home." Victoria felt something cold and heavy settle in her stomach. This wasn't a lost child. This was a kidnapping victim. And whoever had taken her was still out there, searching. She should call the police. She should call child services. She should do 100 things that made logical sense. But she looked into Zadie's terrified eyes, eyes that held the same abandonment, the same betrayal Victoria had seen in her own mirror for 26 years, and she made a choice that would change everything. "I'm going to take you to my apartment," Victoria said quietly. "It's not far. You can get warm, eat something, and sleep, and tomorrow we'll figure out what to do. But right now, you're safe. I promise." Zadie stared at her for a long moment, then, slowly, she nodded. Victoria locked up the diner, carried Zadie to her beat-up 2004 Honda Civic, and drove through the blizzard to her apartment above the laundromat. She carried the shivering child up 3 flights of stairs into her tiny studio and set her gently on the futon. For the next hour, Victoria became someone she'd never been before, a caretaker. She ran a warm bath, she found her smallest clothes, a t-shirt and sweatpants that still swallowed Zadie's tiny frame. She heated up canned soup on her hot plate and watched the child eat with desperate hunger, as if she hadn't had a proper meal in days. And when Zadie's eyes finally started to droop with exhaustion, Victoria tucked her into the futon with every blanket she owned, watching the child's breathing slow and deepen into sleep. Victoria sat on the floor beside the futon, her back against the wall, watching this mysterious child sleep. She noticed the broken gold locket around Zadie's neck, expensive, with a photo of a beautiful woman inside. She noticed the healing bruises on the girl's wrists, marks that looked like restraints. She noticed everything and understood none of it. What had she just done? Who was this child, and who were the bad men hunting her? Victoria should have been terrified. She should have called someone, done something responsible and logical. But as she watched Zadie sleep, safe, warm, no longer alone in a freezing alley, Victoria felt something she hadn't felt in 26 years. She felt like she mattered, like her choice had meant something, like for once in her disposable, invisible life, she had done something that couldn't be undone or taken back. She had saved a life. She had no idea that in less than 12 hours, that choice would cost her everything she knew and give her everything she'd never dared to hope for. Victoria didn't sleep that night. She couldn't. Every sound from the street below, a car passing, a door slamming, footsteps on the sidewalk, made her tense with fear. She kept expecting armed men to kick down her door, to find Zadie, to make Victoria regret her choice. But the night passed slowly, quietly, and when dawn broke gray and cold over Boston, nothing had happened. Zadie woke up around 7 a.m., sitting up in the futon with wide, confused eyes. For a moment, she looked terrified, as if she didn't know where she was. Then she saw Victoria sitting in the corner, wrapped in her work jacket because she'd given all the blankets to the child, and something in her expression softened. "You're still here," Zadie whispered, as if she'd expected to wake up alone again. "Of course I'm still here," Victoria said gently. "Are you hungry? I can make you breakfast. I've got, cereal and toast. That's about it, actually." Zadie nodded, clutching the blankets around her shoulders. Victoria was heating water for instant oatmeal when she heard it. The sound that would change her life forever. Engines. Multiple engines. Powerful and rumbling. Victoria went to the window and looked down at the street below. Her blood turned to ice. 5 black SUVs, Mercedes, expensive, tinted windows, were pulling up in front of the laundromat. They blocked the entire street, arranged in a formation that looked almost military. Car doors opened simultaneously, and men stepped out. 10, 12, maybe 15 men in dark suits and long coats, and every single one of them had the unmistakable bulge of a weapon under their jacket. "No," Victoria breathed. "No, no, no." Zadie appeared beside her, standing on tiptoe to see out the window. The moment she saw the vehicles, she gasped and stumbled backward, her face draining of color. But she didn't look terrified. She looked confused, almost relieved. "Papa," Zadie whispered. "Your father?" Victoria's voice came out higher than normal. "Your father sent those men?" Before Zadie could answer, Victoria's apartment door, which she had locked, bolted, and chain-latched, suddenly clicked open. Someone had picked the locks in seconds. The door swung wide, and a man entered Victoria's tiny studio apartment with the confidence of someone who owned every room he walked into. And Victoria Kensington, who had spent 26 years making herself invisible, suddenly found herself the focus of the most intense attention she'd ever received. The man was tall, over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and a presence that seemed to fill the small space completely. He wore an expensive charcoal suit that probably cost more than Victoria's car. His dark hair was slicked back perfectly, his olive-tanned skin was flawless, but it was his eyes that pinned Victoria in place. Dark brown, almost black, cold and calculating as they swept across her apartment in one dismissive glance before landing on the child beside her. "Zadie," he said, and his voice was deep, controlled, but with an undercurrent of something that might have been relief. "Zadie!" Zadie ran to him, and this terrifying man dropped to one knee to catch his daughter. He wrapped his arms around her, and for just a moment, something cracked in that stone facade. Victoria saw genuine fear and love in his expression. Then he looked up at Victoria, and the coldness returned. "You," he said, standing with Zadie in his arms. "You are Victoria Kensington." It wasn't a question. He already knew her name. Of course he did. Yes, Victoria managed. "Look, I didn't kidnap her. I found her freezing in the alley behind my work. I was just trying to help. I was going to call someone today, I swear." "You saved my daughter's life," the man interrupted. His accent was slight but noticeable. Italian, Victoria thought. "She would have died in that storm. The men who took her would have found her. You brought her here, fed her, kept her safe." He paused. "I am Enzo Russo." The name meant nothing to Victoria. She stared at him blankly. Something flickered in Enzo's eyes. Surprise, maybe, that she didn't recognize the name. Then he continued. "My daughter is everything to me, and you saved her when I could not." He set Zadie gently down, and the little girl clung to his leg. "Under the laws of my family, Miss Kensington, the one who saves a Russo's life becomes bound to the family. You are now under my protection and my authority." Victoria's brain was struggling to process his words. What? I don't understand. I don't want anything from you. I'm just glad she's safe. You can just take her and go. We're good." "I'm afraid it doesn't work that way." Enzo pulled out his phone and made a brief call. "Antonio, send up the men. We're relocating Miss Kensington immediately." "Wait, what?" Victoria took a step back. "Relocating? No, this is my apartment. I have a job. I can't just leave." Enzo looked at her with something that might have been pity. "Your life as you knew it is over, Miss Kensington. You have 10 minutes to pack whatever you cannot live without. Everything else will be provided for you." "Provided?" Victoria's voice was rising toward panic. "Who are you? You can't just come in here and tell me my life is over." "I am Enzo Russo," he repeated, as if that explained everything. "I control everything from here to Providence. I have connections in every level of government, every police department, every institution that matters. The men who took my daughter belong to people who want me dead. Now they know you helped her, which means you are a target. Whether you accept my protection or not, they will come for you. The only question is whether you'll be alive when they arrive." 3 men in suits entered the apartment. They moved with military precision, opening Victoria's few drawers and closet, efficiently packing her belongings. "Stop," Victoria said weakly. "Please, this is insane. I'm nobody. I'm just a waitress. I don't belong in whatever world you're from." Enzo stepped closer, and Victoria found herself backing up until she hit the wall. He didn't touch her, but his proximity was overwhelming. "You became somebody the moment you chose to save my daughter instead of walking away," he said quietly. "You are now under my protection. You belong to my family. This is not negotiable, Miss Kensington. You can either come peacefully or I will have you carried out. But you are coming with me." Victoria looked past him to Zadie, who was watching with those huge dark eyes. The little girl reached out and took Victoria's hand. "Please come," Zadie whispered. "Please don't leave me." And that was it. That was the moment Victoria's last defense crumbled. Because Victoria Kensington, who had been abandoned by everyone who'd ever been supposed to care for her, who had built her entire life around never needing anyone, couldn't walk away from a child who was asking her to stay. "Okay," she heard herself say. "Okay, I'll come." Enzo nodded once, as if he'd never doubted the outcome. Wise choice. 15 minutes later, Victoria found herself in the back of a Mercedes SUV, sitting next to Zadie, watching her entire life disappear in the rearview mirror. The laundromat, her apartment, Sal's diner in the distance. Everything she'd built, gone in an instant. She should have been terrified. Maybe she was, but as Zadie's small hand squeezed hers, and as the SUV carried them toward a world Victoria didn't understand, she felt something else, too. For the first time in 26 years, someone had told her she belonged somewhere, even if it was the most dangerous place she could possibly be. The SUV moved through Boston like a predator cutting through water, smooth, silent, unstoppable. Victoria pressed her face against the tinted window, watching the familiar streets of South Boston blur past. The laundromat, the corner store where she bought her groceries, the bus stop where she waited every morning. All of it disappearing behind her like a life that had belonged to someone else. Zadie had fallen asleep against her shoulder, one small hand still clutching Victoria's sleeve as if afraid she might vanish. Victoria could feel the child's steady breathing, the warmth of her small body, and something twisted painfully in her chest. This little girl had been through something terrible. That much was obvious from the healing bruises, the way she startled at sudden sounds, the terror in her eyes when she'd begged Victoria not to call the police. And now, Victoria was being pulled into whatever nightmare Zadie had escaped from. "Where are we going?" Victoria asked quietly, not wanting to wake the child. Enzo sat across from them, his posture perfect, despite the moving vehicle, his attention on his phone. He didn't look up when he answered. "Home." "Your home," Victoria corrected, "not mine." Now his eyes lifted, dark and unreadable. "Your home now. You'll have your own room, your own space. Anything you need will be provided." "I need my life back," Victoria said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "I need my job, my apartment, Your apartment above a laundromat where the heat barely works." Enzo's tone was matter-of-fact, not cruel. "Your job where you earn less in a week than I spend on a single meal? That life?" He leaned forward slightly. "Miss Kensington, I had you investigated the moment my men identified you from the diner security footage. I know everything about you. Every foster home, every rejection, every year you've spent alone, barely surviving. That is not a life. That is existence." Victoria felt her face flush with humiliation and anger. "You had no right. I had every right. You had my daughter." His voice remained calm, controlled, but there was steel beneath it. "I needed to know who you were, what you wanted, whether you were part of the plot to take her." "And," Victoria demanded, "what did your investigation tell you?" Something shifted in Enzo's expression. Not quite softness, but perhaps the absence of suspicion. "That you are exactly what you appeared to be, a woman who has spent her entire life with nothing, who saved a child because it was the right thing to do, expecting nothing in return, which is precisely why you are now the most dangerous kind of person to have loose in the city." "Dangerous?" Victoria almost laughed. "I'm a waitress. I'm nobody." "You're a witness," Enzo said quietly. "You saw my daughter after she escaped her kidnappers. You may have seen something, heard something, noticed something that could identify who took her, which means the people who orchestrated this will be looking for you. They'll want to know what Zadie told you, what you saw, and they won't ask nicely." The SUV turned off the main road, passing through an ornate iron gate that opened automatically. Victoria caught a glimpse of a guard station, cameras, high walls topped with something that looked like razor wire. "Is this protection?" Victoria whispered. "This looks like a prison." "It's both, and it will keep you alive." The vehicle pulled to a stop in front of a massive building, not quite a mansion, more like a fortress disguised as luxury housing. Stone and glass and metal, beautiful and impenetrable. The kind of place Victoria had only seen in magazines, in lives that had nothing to do with hers. The door opened, and one of the suited men offered his hand to help her out. Victoria ignored it, climbing out on her own, still carrying Zadie. The child stirred, lifting her head to look around, and immediately relaxed when she saw where they were. "Home," Zadie murmured, and Victoria felt that painful twist in her chest again. This child had been terrified in that alley, running for her life. But here, surrounded by armed guards and security cameras, she felt safe. What kind of life was that for a 6-year-old? Enzo moved past them toward the entrance, and Victoria had no choice but to follow. Inside, the space opened up into something out of a luxury hotel. Marble floors, soaring ceilings, artwork that probably cost more than Victoria would earn in her entire lifetime. It was beautiful. It was overwhelming. It was everything Victoria had never been allowed to have. "Maria will show you to your room," Enzo said, gesturing to a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a neat uniform. "You'll find clothes in your size in the closet. My daughter seems attached to you, so you'll be staying in the room adjoining hers." "Wait." Victoria's voice came out smaller than she intended. I have a life. I have responsibilities. I need to call my boss, tell him what happened." "Your boss received a call this morning informing him that you've had a family emergency and won't be returning," Enzo said. "You've been compensated for 6 months of wages. Your apartment has been paid through the end of your lease. Your car will be retrieved and stored. Every loose end has been handled." Victoria stared at him, feeling something cold and hollow spreading through her chest. "You can't just erase someone's life." "I didn't erase it. I ended it. Because keeping you in that life would have gotten you killed. This way, you live. I would think you'd prefer that option." He turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing on the marble, leaving Victoria standing in the entrance of a fortress that was now supposed to be her home. Zadie yawned against her shoulder, and Maria approached with a gentle smile. "Come, dear," she said softly. "Let's get you both settled. You must be exhausted." Victoria followed her up a sweeping staircase, down a hallway lined with more expensive art, to a door that opened into a bedroom 3 times the size of her entire studio apartment. Floor-to-ceiling windows, a bed that looked like a cloud, an attached bathroom with a tub big enough to swim in. It was everything Victoria had never dared to want. And it felt like a beautiful cage. Because Enzo Russo was right about one thing. Her old life was over, whether she wanted it to be or not. She just had no idea that in this new life, she would discover something she'd stopped believing existed, a place where she truly belonged. Victoria stood in the center of the enormous bedroom, turning slowly to take it all in. The king-sized bed with its white silk duvet, the mahogany dresser that looked like an antique, the walk-in closet that Maria had opened to reveal rows of clothing, designer labels, all in Victoria's size, still bearing tags. Everything was perfect. Everything was expensive. Everything felt wrong. Zadie had fallen back asleep the moment Maria laid her in the adjoining room, her small body finally surrendering to exhaustion. Through the open connecting door, she could see her curled under a pale pink comforter, clutching a stuffed rabbit that had been waiting on her pillow. "I've drawn you a bath, dear," Maria said gently, appearing in the bathroom doorway. "You've had quite a shock. The hot water will help." Victoria wanted to refuse, to maintain some shred of control over her own choices, but the truth was she hadn't had a proper bath in years. Her studio apartment only had a narrow shower with temperamental water pressure, and she was exhausted, bone-deep tired in a way that went beyond physical fatigue. "Thank you," she heard herself say. Maria smiled and slipped out, closing the door quietly behind her. Victoria was alone in a room larger than anywhere she'd ever lived, surrounded by luxury she'd never imagined having, and she had never felt more trapped in her entire life. She sank into the bath, ridiculous, decadent, with water that stayed hot and fragrant bubbles that smelled like lavender, and felt tears burning behind her eyes. She wouldn't cry. She hadn't cried since she was 14, running away from Gerald's house in the rain. Crying didn't fix anything. Crying didn't change reality. Crying was a waste of energy. But God, she was tired of reality. Victoria closed her eyes and let herself sink deeper into the water. This was temporary, she told herself. Everything in her life had always been temporary. The Hendersons' house with the cookies had been temporary. The group home on Ashmont Street had been temporary. Her studio apartment above the laundromat had been temporary. This gilded cage would be temporary too. She just had to survive it. That's what she'd always done. Survived. She'd survived abandonment, rejection, poverty, loneliness. She could survive luxury and protection from a man who treated her like a problem to be managed. The thought of Enzo made something complicated twist in her chest. He terrified her, the cold authority in his voice, the casual way he dismantled her entire life in a single morning, the armed men who moved at his command. But there had been that moment when he'd held Zadie, when something human had cracked through that stone exterior. He loved his daughter, that much was clear. And he'd had Victoria investigated, knew about the foster homes, the rejections, the years of barely surviving. The humiliation of that burned through her. He'd seen all her wounds, all her failures, everything she'd worked so hard to bury and forget. Victoria climbed out of the bath and dried off with a towel so soft it felt like sin. In the closet, she found yoga pants and cashmere sweater, casual clothes, but probably worth more than a month of her wages. She put them on and caught a reflection in the full-length mirror. She looked the same. Dark hair, hazel eyes, too thin frame from years of stretching groceries. But she was dressed like someone else, someone who belonged in a place like this. Except she didn't belong here. She would never belong here. Victoria walked to the window and looked out at the grounds below. The high walls, the guards patrolling with weapons clearly visible, the iron gates that had closed behind them. This wasn't a home. It was a fortress, a beautiful prison where she was an inmate who'd committed the crime of kindness. A soft sound made her turn. Zadie stood in the connecting doorway, the stuffed rabbit clutched in her arms, her eyes wide and uncertain. "You're still here," the little girl whispered, exactly as she had that morning. And Victoria understood. Zadie had lost her mother 6 months ago. That much she'd paced together from Enzo's brief comments and Maria's gentle explanations. The child had been kidnapped, terrorized, and now she was afraid that anyone who showed her kindness would disappear too. Victoria knew that fear. She'd lived that fear her entire life. "I'm still here," Victoria said softly, moving toward the child. "I'm not going anywhere." The lie tasted bitter on her tongue, because eventually she would leave. She had to. Nothing good in her life had ever lasted, and this, whatever this was, wouldn't be any different. Enzo would decide she was no longer useful or no longer a target, and she'd be sent away with a check and a new identity and instructions to never contact them again. That's how it always worked. People didn't keep Victoria Kensington. They never had. But Zadie didn't need to know that. Not yet. Not when she was 6 years old and grieving and traumatized. So Victoria knelt down and opened her arms, and when Zadie ran into them, clinging with desperate strength, Victoria held her tight and pretended this could be real. pretended she could be someone worth keeping. Pretended that maybe, just maybe, this time would be different, even though she knew better. She'd always known better. That night, Victoria lay in the enormous bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to Zadie's steady breathing from the next room. Somewhere in the building, guards patrolled, cameras watched. Enzo Russo controlled everything within these walls with absolute authority. And Victoria Kensington, foster kid, waitress, survivor, was trapped in luxury she'd never asked for, protecting a child she couldn't afford to love, in a world where one dangerous man had decided her fate without asking her permission. Tomorrow, she told herself. Tomorrow, she would find a way to regain some control. Tomorrow, she would make Enzo understand that she wasn't his property, wasn't his responsibility, wasn't someone who could be claimed and kept. Tomorrow, she would remember that attachment was dangerous, that caring led to loss, that the only person she could count on was herself. But tonight, with Zadie sleeping safely in the next room, Victoria let herself pretend that being needed felt like belonging. Just for tonight. Victoria woke to sunlight streaming through windows she'd forgotten to cover, and the disorienting sensation of sleeping in a bed that didn't creak or sag. For 3 confused seconds, she didn't know where she was. Then reality crashed back. The fortress, Enzo Russo, the life that had been stolen and replaced overnight. She sat up and immediately looked toward the connecting door. It was open, exactly as she'd left it, but Zadie's bed was empty. Victoria's heart lurched. She threw off the covers and rushed into the adjoining room, panic rising in her throat. The little girl was gone. The stuffed rabbit lay abandoned on the pillow. Had someone taken her? Had the kidnappers somehow? Miss Kensington? Victoria spun to find Maria standing in the main doorway, a breakfast tray in her hands and a knowing smile on her face. "She's with you, dear. Look." Maria nodded toward Victoria's own room. Victoria turned and saw what she'd missed in her panic. A small figure curled up on the floor beside her bed, wrapped in the pink comforter, fast asleep. "She does that," Maria said softly, setting the tray on a side table. "Every night since her mother passed. She can't sleep unless she's near someone. Usually she camps outside Mr. Russo's door, but last night—" She trailed off, her expression tender. "Last night she chose you." Victoria's throat tightened. She walked back into her room and knelt beside the sleeping child. Zadie's face was peaceful in sleep, one hand tucked under her cheek, her breathing soft and steady. She looked so small, so fragile, so heartbreakingly young to carry the kind of trauma that made you sleep on floors to be near another human being. "How long has she been like this?" Victoria whispered. 6 months. Maria's voice carried the weight of shared grief. Since the night Mrs. Russo died. Car accident. Zadie was in the vehicle too. She survived without a scratch, but she watched her mother. Maria paused, composing herself. "She hasn't been the same since. She speaks only when absolutely necessary, and even then barely above a whisper. Mr. Russo brought in therapists, child psychologists, specialists from around the world. Nothing helped. She just disappeared inside herself." Victoria reached out and gently brushed a strand of light brown hair from Zadie's face. The little girl stirred, but didn't wake. "Mr. Russo blames himself," Maria continued. "He'd been receiving threats for months before the accident. He thinks someone tampered with his wife's car. The investigation was inconclusive, but he's convinced it was meant for him, that his world, his choices, killed the woman he loved and broke his daughter." "Is that why he's so—" Victoria searched for the right word. "Cold?" Maria supplied gently. "He wasn't always like this. Before the accident, he smiled. He laughed with Zadie. He was still a dangerous man, don't misunderstand, but he was also a father and a husband. Now he's just locked away, like Zadie, but in a different way. Victoria looked up at the housekeeper. "Why are you telling me this?" Maria met her gaze steadily. "Because in the 15 hours you've been here, Zadie has chosen to sleep beside your bed. She hasn't done that with anyone except her father since the accident. Not the nannies, not the therapists, not me, and I've known her since she was born." She paused. "Whatever you did for her that night in the storm, whatever you gave her, it reached somewhere the rest of us couldn't touch." After Maria left, Victoria showered and dressed in more of the impossibly expensive casual clothes from the closet. When she emerged, Zadie was awake, sitting on the edge of Victoria's bed, the stuffed rabbit clutched in her arms. She watched Victoria with those enormous dark eyes, silent and wary. "Good morning," Victoria said softly. "Are you hungry?" Zadie nodded but didn't speak. The morning routine that followed felt surreal. Maria brought breakfast to a sunny sitting room, not the grand, formal dining room, but a smaller, warmer space with comfortable furniture and wide windows overlooking a garden. Victoria sat with Zadie, watching the little girl pick at her food with mechanical movements, eating because she was supposed to, not because she wanted to. "The pancakes are good," Victoria offered, trying to find some way to connect. "Better than anything I've ever had." Zadie looked at her, and Victoria saw something flicker in her eyes. Curiosity, maybe, or the ghost of a response. "I used to make pancakes," Zadie whispered, so quietly Victoria almost missed it. "With Mama." Victoria's heart cracked a little wider. "Yeah? What kind?" "Chocolate chip." The words were barely audible. "She let me put in too many." "Too many chocolate chips?" Victoria smiled. "I don't think there is such a thing as too many chocolate chips." The smallest hint of something, not quite a smile, but the memory of one, touched Zadie's lips before disappearing. The rest of the day unfolded in a strange domestic rhythm. Zadie followed Victoria everywhere. When Victoria tried to find a quiet corner to sit and process her situation, Zadie appeared beside her. When Victoria went looking for Maria to ask about borrowing a book, Zadie's small hand slipped into hers. When Victoria stood at the window staring out at her beautiful prison, Zadie stood next to her, silent and present. The child never spoke unless Victoria asked her a direct question, and even then her answers came in whispers of just a few words. But she was always there, a small shadow, watching Victoria with an intensity that felt like drowning and being saved at the same time. By evening, Victoria's carefully maintained walls were starting to crumble. She'd promised herself she wouldn't get attached. Attachment led to loss. Attachment meant pain. She'd survived 26 years by not letting anyone matter. But Zadie wasn't asking for anything. She wasn't demanding love or making promises she'd break. She was just there, choosing Victoria's presence over solitude, trusting her in a way the little girl clearly trusted no one else. That night, when Victoria tucked Zadie into bed, the child's hand caught her sleeve. "Will you stay?" Zadie whispered, "until I fall asleep?" Victoria should have said no, should have maintained boundaries, should have protected herself. "Of course," she heard herself say instead. She sat on the edge of the bed, and Zadie's small hand found hers in the darkness. Victoria held it gently, feeling the child's breathing slow and deepen, feeling something dangerous and inevitable taking root in her chest. This was a mistake. This would hurt. This would end the way everything in her life ended, with Victoria alone again, grieving something she should have never let herself want. But as Zadie's fingers tightened around hers, even in sleep, Victoria couldn't bring herself to pull away. Maybe some mistakes were worth making, even if they broke you in the end. On the third morning, Victoria was summoned. She'd been sitting in the sunny room with Zadie, reading aloud from a picture book about a rabbit who learned to be brave, when Maria appeared in the doorway with an apologetic expression. "Mr. Russo requests your presence in his office," Maria said quietly. Immediately. Something in her tone made Victoria's stomach drop. This wasn't a polite invitation, it was a command. Victoria looked at Zadie, who had gone very still, her fingers clutching the stuffed rabbit. "I'll be right back," Victoria said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. Zadie's eyes went wide with something that looked like fear. Maria led Victoria through corridors she hadn't seen before, deeper into the fortress, away from the warm domestic spaces into areas that felt colder, more functional. They stopped at a heavy wooden door. Maria knocked once, then opened it and gestured for Victoria to enter. The room was clearly an office, but it felt more like an interrogation chamber. Dark wood paneling, minimal furniture, no windows. A large desk dominated one end, but Victoria's attention went immediately to the three men standing in the center of the room. Enzo stood slightly apart, his expression unreadable. The other two men were built like soldiers. Broad shoulders, cold eyes, the kind of stillness that came from violence held carefully in check. One was tall, with graying hair and a scar that ran from his temple to his jaw. The other was younger, maybe 40, with dark eyes and the kind of face that revealed nothing. "Miss Kensington," Enzo said, "these are two of my most trusted men. This is Antonio, my head of security." He gestured to the older man with the scar. "And this is Marco, my second in command." The younger man with the dead eyes. Marco. Victoria filed the name away, though she didn't know why it felt important. "They have questions for you," Enzo continued. "I suggest you answer honestly." Antonio moved first, circling her slowly like a predator assessing prey. "Tell us about the night you found Zadie." Victoria recounted it. The storm, the sound behind the dumpster, finding the child. She tried to keep her voice steady, but Antonio's circling was making her nervous. "And you just happened to be there?" Marco's voice was smooth, almost pleasant. Somehow that made it worse. "At exactly the right time?" "I was doing my job." "What did the child tell you about who took her, what she saw?" Antonio demanded. "Did she describe them? Did she mention names, locations?" "She's 6 years old and traumatized. She barely spoke." Marco stepped closer, and Victoria fought the urge to back away. "You understand why we're suspicious, Miss Kensington. A woman with no family, no connections, no money. You rescue the daughter of one of the most powerful men in the city. What did you expect to gain?" "Nothing." Victoria's voice cracked with frustration. "I expected to help a freezing child. I didn't know who she was. I didn't know who her father was. I don't know anything about your world." "Ignorance can be a convincing act," Marco said softly. "It's not an act." Victoria turned to Enzo, who had remained silent throughout. "You investigated me. You know I'm nobody. Why would anyone use me as part of a plan? I can barely afford groceries." "Poverty makes people desperate," Antonio said. "Desperate people do desperate things for money." "I don't want money." Victoria was almost shouting now. "I just wanted to help." "No one is that selfless," Marco said, his tone almost pitying. "Everyone wants something, Miss Kensington. The question is what you're really after." The questions continued, relentless and circular. They asked about her past, the foster homes, the years alone, whether she'd ever been contacted by anyone connected to organized crime. They asked about her debts, her relationships, her political views, her internet history. They dissected every moment of the night she'd found Zadie, looking for inconsistencies, for cracks in her story. Victoria felt herself starting to shake. This wasn't an interview. This was an accusation. They'd already decided she was guilty of something, and they were just waiting for her to slip up and prove it. "You claim you had no idea who the child was," Antonio said, leaning in close enough that Victoria could smell his cologne. "But you didn't call the police. You didn't take her to a hospital. You took her to your apartment and kept her hidden. Why?" "Because she was terrified. She begged me not to call anyone." "Or because you were waiting for instructions," Marco suggested, waiting for your handlers to tell you what to do next. I don't have handlers, Victoria's voice broke. I don't have anyone. The door burst open. Zadie stood in the doorway, her face flushed, tears streaming down her cheeks. She ran straight to Victoria and threw herself between her and the men, her small body rigid with defiance. She didn't speak, couldn't speak, but she spread her arms wide as if she could physically shield Victoria from them. The room went completely silent. Maria appeared in the doorway, breathless and apologetic. I'm sorry, Mr. Russo. She ran before I could stop her. Enzo held up one hand, and Maria fell silent. He was staring at his daughter with an expression Victoria couldn't quite read. Surprise, certainly, but something else. Something that looked almost like hope. Zadie turned to face her father, still standing in front of Victoria, and for the first time in 6 months, she spoke in a voice louder than a whisper. Stop. Her voice shaking but clear. Stop being mean to Victoria. She saved me. She's good. Stop. The silence stretched, heavy and absolute. Then Enzo moved. He crossed the room and knelt in front of his daughter, his hand gentle on her shoulder. You're right, he said quietly. We're done here. He stood and looked at Antonio and Marco. Leave us. The two men hesitated, then left without a word. The door closed behind them. Enzo turned to Victoria, who was still shaking, Zadie clutched against her. My daughter has not raised her voice or defended anyone since her mother died. She has barely spoken at all. But she just stood between you and my men. She just broke 6 months of silence to protect you. Victoria didn't know what to say. That is all the testimony I need, Miss Kensington. You are not a plant. You are not an enemy. You are simply what you appeared to be, someone good who chose to help when you could have walked away. He paused. You have passed the test, Miss Kensington. Welcome to my family. Over the following weeks, Victoria discovered building trust with a traumatized child was like coaxing a wild bird to eat from your hand. It required infinite patience, absolute stillness, and the willingness to let the child set every boundary. Zadie followed her everywhere, but the little girl's presence was complicated. Some days she would sit close enough for their shoulders to touch while Victoria read aloud. Other days she maintained careful distance, watching from across the room with those enormous dark eyes, as if testing whether Victoria would still be there. She looked away. Victoria learned Zadie's rhythms. The nightmares came almost every night around 2 a.m. Victoria would wake to the sound of whimpering from the adjoining room and find the child thrashing in her sheets, trapped in some horror she couldn't escape even in sleep. Victoria would sit on the edge of the bed, smoothing Zadie's hair back from her damp forehead, humming songs she half remembered from her own childhood, until the little girl's breathing steadied, and she sank back into calmer dreams. On the good days, Zadie would take Victoria's hand and lead her to the enormous kitchen where Maria presided over gleaming appliances Victoria had only seen in magazines. Together, they made cookies, chocolate chip, just like Zadie used to make with her mother. Victoria let the child measure ingredients, crack eggs, and yes, add too many chocolate chips. And when Zadie licked batter from her finger and something that almost resembled joy flickered across her face, Victoria felt something dangerous bloom in her chest. This was attachment. This was caring. This was exactly what she'd promised herself she wouldn't do. But how could she not? How could anyone watch this broken child slowly, painfully begin to heal and not feel their heart crack open? 3 weeks into her captivity, because that's what it was, no matter how luxurious the cage, Victoria was reading to Zadie in the sunny sitting room when Enzo appeared in the doorway. He'd been largely absent, appearing only at dinner where he sat at the head of the table in silence while Zadie picked at her food and Victoria tried not to feel like an imposter in someone else's life. Miss Kensington, he said. A word. It wasn't a request. Victoria looked at Zadie, who had gone very still. I'll be right back, she said softly, and the little girl nodded, clutching the stuffed rabbit tighter. She followed Enzo to his office, not the interrogation room from before, but a different space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the garden. He gestured to a chair across from his desk. Victoria sat, feeling like a student called before the principal. Enzo remained standing, his hands in his pockets, studying her with that unsettling intensity. "My daughter smiles now," he said finally. "Not often, not easily, but she smiles. She speaks more than 3 words at a time. Last night, she laughed at something you said during dinner." Victoria didn't know how to respond. "I need to understand who you are," Enzo continued. "Not the investigation report, not the facts. I need to hear it from you. Why does a woman who has nothing give everything to a stranger's child?" Victoria's throat tightened. "I already know my history. I know the facts. I don't know who you are." He moved to sit on the edge of his desk, closer now, his dark eyes locked on hers. "Tell me, why did you save Zadie when walking away would have been easier, safer?" "Because," Victoria's voice caught. She looked down at her hands. "Because I know what it feels like to be that child, cold, scared, convinced no one will come. I spent my whole childhood being the kid everyone walked away from. I couldn't—" She swallowed hard. "I couldn't be another person who left her in the dark." The silence stretched between them, heavy with understanding. "Your file said you were abandoned at a hospital," Enzo said quietly. "That you spent 18 years moving between homes where no one wanted you, that you aged out of the system alone." Victoria nodded, not trusting her voice. "I lost my wife 6 months ago," Enzo said, and something in his controlled voice finally cracked. "Someone tampered with her car. Zadie was in the vehicle. She watched her mother die, and I couldn't stop it, couldn't prevent it, couldn't save either of them from my world." He paused. "We are both survivors of losses that should have destroyed us. Perhaps that is why my daughter trusts you. She recognizes survival when she sees it." Victoria looked up and met his eyes. For the first time, she didn't see the cold mafia boss. She saw a father drowning in grief and guilt, watching his daughter disappear and powerless to bring her back. "She's coming back," Victoria said softly. "Slowly, but she's coming back." "Because of you," Enzo replied. "You are saving her the way I could not." Something shifted in that moment, a mutual recognition, an understanding forged in shared loss. They were both broken people trying to protect a child who deserved better than the hand life had dealt her. And neither of them knew how to do it alone. 5 weeks after Victoria's life had been turned upside down, Enzo summoned her to a part of the fortress she'd never seen, the security center, buried deep in the basement where natural light couldn't reach and the hum of electronics filled the air like a mechanical heartbeat. "I need your help," he said without preamble, leading her past rows of monitors displaying every angle of the compound. Guards nodded as they passed, their eyes curious but professionally blank. They entered a private room with a single large screen and 2 chairs. Enzo gestured for her to sit. "We've been investigating the kidnapping," he explained, pulling up files on the screen. "The men who took Zadie are dead. They were found 3 days after she escaped, executed by whoever hired them to cover the trail. But we have surveillance footage from around the city that night. Street cameras, traffic lights, security feeds from businesses. I need you to look at faces. Anyone you might have seen near the diner. Anyone who seemed out of place." Victoria's stomach twisted. "Enzo, I was only outside for a few minutes. It was snowing so hard I could barely see." "I know, but sometimes we see more than we realize in the moment." His voice was gentle but insistent. "Please, try." For the next 2 hours, Victoria watched grainy footage scroll past. Cars on highways, figures in winter coats, faces blurred by snow and distance. Her eyes started to ache, her mind going numb with the repetition of it all. "I'm sorry," she said finally. "I don't recognize anyone. It was too dark, too chaotic. I only saw Zadie." Enzo nodded, disappointment flickering across his features. It was worth trying. He began closing files, pulling up older surveillance footage, internal security from the compound itself. These are from the weeks before the kidnapping. Sometimes seeing familiar faces triggers... Victoria's hand shot out and gripped his arm. "Wait! Stop!" Enzo froze the image. It showed the entrance hall of the fortress, several men in suits standing in conversation, casual, unremarkable, except for one detail. "Him," Victoria whispered, pointing at a man on the right side of the frame. "His hand." Enzo leaned closer. "What about it?" "Can you zoom in?" He did. The image pixelated slightly, but remained clear enough. The man's right hand rested on the back of a chair, and across the skin were 3 distinctive scars, parallel lines, old but prominent, running from his knuckles toward his wrist. Victoria's breath caught in her throat. "I saw that hand." Enzo went very still beside her. "Where?" "That night, when I found Zadie." The memory came rushing back with painful clarity. "Before I heard her whimper, I saw a car, a dark sedan parked on the street near the diner, engine running. I thought maybe someone was lost or having car trouble. I could see someone in the driver's seat, and when they reached up to adjust the rear view mirror, I pointed at the screen. I saw those scars. The light from the dashboard hit their hand, and I remember thinking it looked like claw marks." The silence in the room was suffocating. "You're certain?" Enzo said, his voice dangerously quiet. "I know what I saw, but Enzo, if he's that close to you, if he has that much access, accusing him could be dangerous for both of us. More dangerous than letting a traitor remain at my side?" Enzo closed the file and turned to face her fully. His eyes were dark, calculating, but beneath the surface, she saw rage, cold and controlled, and absolutely lethal. "If Marco was involved, if he helped orchestrate my daughter's kidnapping," his hands clenched into fists, "I need to be absolutely certain before I act. Can you swear to me this is what you saw?" Victoria met his gaze and thought about Zadie sleeping peacefully upstairs, about the nightmares that still came, about the terror in that little girl's eyes when she'd begged Victoria not to call the police because bad men were everywhere. "I swear it," she said. "That was the hand I saw." Enzo stood, his movements precise and controlled, but Victoria could sense the violence coiling beneath his calm exterior. "Then we investigate, carefully, quietly. Marco cannot know we suspect him." "What do you need me to do?" "Nothing," Enzo said firmly. "You continue exactly as you have been. Care for Zadie, maintain the routine, act as if this conversation never happened. If Marco is guilty, he's already paranoid. Any change in behavior could spook him." Victoria nodded, but fear was crawling up her spine. "And if I'm wrong? If it's just a coincidence?" Enzo looked at her for a long moment. "Then I will have investigated a loyal man and apologized. But Victoria," he stepped closer, his voice dropping lower, "I choose to trust them again. Don't doubt yourself now." As they left the security center and returned to the upper floors where sunlight and normalcy waited, Victoria couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just set something irreversible into motion. She'd pointed at a man in a position of ultimate trust and called him a traitor. And if she was right, the war that followed would be brutal. The investigation took 3 weeks, and Victoria watched Enzo transform into someone she barely recognized, a man who smiled at Marco over dinner while quietly dismantling his second-in-command's life, piece by careful piece. Enzo brought Victoria into his confidence in a way that shocked her. Late at night, after Zadie was asleep, he would summon her to his office, where Antonio, the scarred head of security who'd once circled her like prey, would present their findings. Bank records obtained through channels Victoria didn't want to know about, encrypted communications cracked by specialists who existed in shadows, surveillance footage that told a story of betrayal so deep it made her sick. "Here," Antonio said, one night, pulling up a series of financial transactions on the screen. "Marco's been receiving payments through a shell corporation in the Caymans. The money originates from an account controlled by the Castellano family." Victoria sat in the corner of the office, trying to make herself small, still not quite believing she was part of these conversations. But Enzo insisted. "You saw what trained soldiers missed. Your perspective matters." "How much?" Enzo's voice was ice. "2 million over the past year," Antonio replied. "Small deposits, irregular timing, designed to avoid detection." Enzo's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. "And the communications?" Antonio pulled up decrypted messages. Victoria read them over his shoulder and felt her blood run cold. The messages were brief, coded, but their meaning was clear enough once you understood the context. References to the package and extraction timeline and leverage points. Discussions of how to move Zadie, where to hold her, how long before Enzo would break. "There's more," Antonio said grimly. He pulled up a new file. "We traced the burner phone Marco used for these communications. It pinged off towers near your diner the night Zadie was taken." Victoria's hand went to her throat. He was there, watching. Likely coordinating the kidnapping, making sure his hired men did the job correctly. He turned to look at her. "If you hadn't found Zadie when you did, Marco would have retrieved her within the hour. She would have disappeared completely." The weight of that statement settled over the room like a shroud. "But who's he working with?" Victoria asked. "The Castellanos are paying him, but someone inside your organization had to be planning this. Someone who knew your security, your schedule, your vulnerabilities." Enzo and Antonio exchanged a look. "Show her," Enzo said quietly. Antonio pulled up surveillance footage from a restaurant, high-end, private room, taken with a hidden camera. 2 men sat across from each other, their body language suggesting conspiracy. One was Marco. The other made Victoria's breath catch. He looked like Enzo. Same build, same dark hair, similar features, but younger, with a harder edge, and eyes that held none of Enzo's controlled intensity, only ambition and resentment. "My brother," Enzo said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Luca Russo." Victoria stared at the screen. "Your own brother wanted to kidnap Zadie?" "He wants my position," Enzo replied flatly. "He's always believed he should lead the family. When my wife died and He paused, something raw flickering across his face. "When I withdrew to deal with my grief, he saw weakness, opportunity. He approached the Castellanos with a deal, help him take control, and he'd cede territory they've wanted for years." "And Zadie was the leverage," Victoria said, understanding dawning like nausea. "Kidnap her, force you to step down to save her, then eliminate us both once the transfer of power was complete," Antonio finished grimly. "A grieving father and his traumatized daughter. An accident, a tragedy, very tidy." Victoria felt sick. How can someone do that to their own family? "Power makes people capable of anything," Enzo said. He stood and moved to the window, his back to them. "Luca was always ambitious, but I never thought he'd hurt Zadie. She's his niece, his blood." "Blood means nothing to some people," Victoria said quietly, thinking of her own biological mother who'd left her on a hospital chair. Enzo turned to look at her, and something in his expression shifted. Recognition, perhaps, or shared understanding. "So what do we do?" Victoria asked. "You can't just confront them. If they know you're onto them, they'll accelerate their timeline. Antonio agreed. Strike before we can move against them. Which means we need to strike first, Enzo said, but carefully. Marco is paranoid and Luca is desperate. One wrong move and they'll scatter, go underground, and we'll never be safe. Victoria stood, crossing to the desk where photographs of Marco and Luca were spread like cards in a deadly game. You need to make them think they're winning, she said slowly, that their plan is still working. Both men looked at her. You've been withdrawn since your waif died, Victoria continued, her mind racing. What if you withdrew more, became more erratic, more distracted, made them think you're on the edge of breaking? They'd believe their moment was coming. They'd get sloppy. Enzo studied her with those dark, intense eyes. And while they're watching me fall apart? You prepare the trap, Victoria finished. Let them think they're hunting you, when really you're hunting them. Antonio smiled, sharp and predatory. The girl has a point. It's dangerous, Enzo said. If they sense the deception, they won't, Victoria interrupted, because I'll be part of it. Everyone knows Zadie's attached to me. If you start pushing me away, treating me coldly in front of Marco, it'll look like you're spiraling, like you resent me for saving her when you couldn't. It'll sell the story. Enzo crossed to her, standing close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. You understand what you're volunteering for? If this goes wrong, if they discover what we're planning, you and Zadie become targets again. Victoria thought about the little girls sleeping upstairs, about the nightmares that were finally starting to fade, about the smile that had appeared on her face yesterday when they'd made cookies together. Zadie's already a target. So am I. The only question is whether we fight back or wait for them to strike again. Enzo held her gaze for a long moment, and Victoria saw respect there. Real respect, not the grudging acknowledgement of before. All right, we play their game, and when the moment comes, we end this, permanently. The safe house sat deep in the Catskill Mountains, surrounded by pine trees and winter silence. It looked like a luxury cabin from the outside, all wood and glass and stone, but Victoria had seen the reinforced steel beneath the rustic facade, the surveillance cameras hidden in the eaves, the panic room buried in the basement, with walls thick enough to survive anything short of a bomb. 3 days, Enzo had told her before he left. Maybe 4. Stay inside. Follow Antonio's instructions. I'll handle Marco personally. That had been 2 days ago. 2 days of watching Zadie color in the spacious living room while armed guards patrolled outside. 2 days of pretending everything was fine while Victoria's instincts screamed that something was wrong. On the 3rd night, Zadie woke Victoria at 2 a.m., her small hand shaking Victoria's shoulder. But this time, it wasn't a nightmare. Bad car, Zadie whispered, her eyes wide with the same terror Victoria had seen that night in the alley. Like before. Victoria's blood turned to ice. She moved to the window and peered through the curtains. Down the long driveway, barely visible in the darkness, headlights approached. Multiple vehicles, moving slowly, deliberately. No reason for anyone to be on this private road at 2 a.m. She grabbed Zadie and ran for the hallway. "Antonio!" she shouted. The head of security appeared from his room, weapon already drawn. He looked out the window and his face went hard. "Get to the panic room, now." Victoria scooped Zadie into her arms and ran for the basement stairs. Behind her, she heard Antonio barking orders into his radio, heard the other guards scrambling into defensive positions. The panic room was at the end of a concrete corridor, a heavy steel door with a biometric lock. She was halfway down the stairs when the windows exploded. Gunfire erupted from every direction, not the sharp cracks for movies, but deafening, overwhelming noise that made Victoria's ears ring. She stumbled, nearly fell, caught herself on the railing. Zadie was screaming, her arms locked around Victoria's neck. "It's okay, baby, it's okay," Victoria gasped, knowing it was a lie, knowing nothing was okay. She made it to the basement and ran down the corridor. Behind her, the sounds of the firefight intensified, shouts, breaking glass, the heavy thud of bodies hitting floors. She reached the panic room and pressed her palm against the scanner. It beeped, began to process. Come on, come on. Pain exploded across her left shoulder, spinning her sideways. Victoria cried out and nearly dropped Zadie, but somehow kept her grip. She looked down and saw blood spreading across her shirt. She'd been shot. Somehow, a bullet had found her through the chaos, a ricochet or a lucky shot, or just the universe's cruel sense of timing. The panic room door clicked open. Victoria shoved Zadie inside and followed, her left arm suddenly useless and screaming with pain. She slammed the door shut and heard the locks engage, heavy bolts sliding into place, sealing them in. The room was small, maybe 10 by 10, with a single cot, supplies, and a monitor showing feeds from the security cameras. Zadie was sobbing, and Victoria gathered her close with her good arm, pressing them both into the corner farthest from the door. "We're safe now," she whispered, even as blood soaked through her shirt and dripped onto the concrete floor. "We're safe." On the monitors, Victoria watched hell unfold. Antonio and his men were outnumbered but fighting with lethal precision. Bodies fell on both sides. Then she saw him, Luca Russo, directing his men from behind an SUV, his face twisted with rage and desperation. The firefight lasted forever, and no time at all. Victoria held Zadie, singing lullabies over the sound of violence, her shoulder burning with agony, her blood making a small pool on the floor. She felt dizzy, lightheaded, but she couldn't pass out, couldn't leave Zadie alone in the dark. Then the monitor showed new vehicles arriving, more men pouring out. But these weren't enemies. Victoria recognized the formations, the coordination. Enzo's main security force, and Enzo himself moving through the chaos like death incarnate, his weapon firing with surgical precision. The tide turned immediately. Luca's men tried to retreat, but there was nowhere to go. Victoria watched Luca himself try to run for the trees and saw Enzo intercept him. She couldn't hear the words exchanged, but she saw Luca raise his weapon and Enzo move faster, his shot dropping his brother instantly. Then Enzo turned toward the house, and Victoria saw him stagger. "No," she breathed. He'd been hit, maybe twice. He pressed his hand to his side, and it came away dark with blood, but he kept moving, kept giving orders, kept directing his men even as his legs threatened to give out. The all-clear came 20 minutes later, a voice on the intercom saying it was safe to emerge. Victoria tried to stand and nearly collapsed. She'd lost too much blood, her shoulder was on fire, and Zadie was clinging to her with terrified strength. "I need you to be brave one more time," Victoria whispered. "Can you help me walk?" Zadie nodded, tears streaming down her face, and together they made their way to the door. Victoria managed to unlock it, and they stumbled into the corridor. Bodies lay everywhere. Enemies, mostly, but two of Antonio's men as well. Victoria kept Zadie's face pressed against her side, trying to shield her from the carnage. They emerged into the main floor to find Antonio coordinating cleanup, his own arm bleeding, but his voice steady. He saw Victoria and swore. "You need a medic." "Where's Enzo?" Victoria interrupted. Antonio pointed toward the living room. Victoria staggered that direction, still carrying Zadie, and found Enzo sitting against the wall, two medics working frantically on his torso. His shirt soaked with blood, his face pale, but his eyes were open. Those eyes found Victoria, and something cracked in his expression. "You're alive," he said roughly. Victoria's legs finally gave out. She collapsed to her knees beside him, Zadie still in her arms, and only then did she start to cry. Great gasping sobs that she couldn't control, all the terror and pain and fear pouring out of her. "You're alive," she choked out. "You're both alive." Enzo reached out with a blood-stained hand and touched her face. "Because of you. You got her to safety." "I came," Victoria whispered. "You came for us." "Always," Enzo said, and his eyes held a promise Victoria had never dared hope for. "I will always come for you." Then the medics were pulling Victoria away, treating her wound, and someone was taking Zadie gently from her arms. But through the chaos and pain, Victoria held on to that word. Always. Maybe, for the first time in her life, someone meant it. 2 weeks after the safe house, Victoria stood in front of the mirror in her bedroom, examining the scar on her shoulder. The wound had healed cleanly. Enzo had flown in the best surgeons, spared no expense, but the mark would remain, a reminder of the night she'd discovered what she was willing to die for. Zadie appeared in the doorway, the stuffed rabbit tucked under her arm. She'd started speaking in full sentences now, her voice gaining strength every day. "Papa wants to see you. In his office." Something in her tone made Victoria's chest tighten with apprehension. She found Enzo behind his desk, looking fully recovered despite the 2 bullets that nearly killed him. His color was back, his movements fluid again, but there was something in his expression she couldn't read, something heavy and resolved. "Sit," he said gently. Victoria sat, her hands clasped in her lap, waiting. Enzo slid a manila folder across the desk. "The threats are eliminated. Marco is dead. Luca is dead. The Castellano family has been convinced to pursue peace. You and Zadie are safe now." "That's good," Victoria said carefully. "That's what we wanted." "Yes." Enzo opened the folder, revealing documents. Inside, you'll find a new identity, complete with passport, birth certificate, driver's license. Victoria Chen, born in Portland, clean history. There's also a bank account in that name containing $500,000, enough to start over anywhere you choose. Victoria stared at the papers, her heart starting to pound. "What are you saying?" "I'm giving you your freedom." Enzo's voice was steady, but something in his eyes betrayed him. "You never chose this life. It was forced on you. You fulfilled any obligation to this family 1,000 times over. You saved my daughter. You helped me eliminate a conspiracy that would have destroyed us. You nearly died protecting Zadie." He paused. "You deserve a normal life, Victoria. You deserve safety, peace, a future that doesn't involve guns and violence and men like me." "Men like you," Victoria repeated slowly. "Dangerous men. Men whose world breaks good people." He stood and moved to the window, his back to her. "You are good, Victoria. Genuinely, impossibly good, and I won't be responsible for corrupting that. I won't watch this world turn you into something you're not." Victoria looked down at the folder. A new identity, $500,000, freedom to go anywhere, be anyone, build the normal life she'd always told herself she wanted. She thought about her studio apartment above the laundromat, the late shifts at Sal's diner, the loneliness that had been her only constant companion for 26 years, the careful walls she'd built to protect herself from hoping for more. Then she thought about Zadie's arms around her neck, the little girl's whispered, "I love you," 3 nights ago, the first time she'd said those words since her mother died. The way Zadie had started calling her Mama so naturally that Victoria's heart broke and healed simultaneously every time she heard it. She thought about Enzo sitting beside her in his office late at night, both of them survivors of different wars, finding unexpected understanding and shared loss. She thought about family, not the kind you were born into, but the kind that claimed you, the kind that fought for you, the kind that gave you a choice and trusted you to make it freely. Victoria picked up the folder, and for a moment Enzo's shoulders tensed as if bracing for impact. Then she tore it in half. The sound of ripping paper was loud in the quiet office. Victoria tore it again and again until the documents were confetti in her hands. She let the pieces fall to the desk. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, her voice steady and sure. Enzo turned, his expression stunned. "Victoria," Victoria interrupted, "you gave me something I'd never had. A place to belong, a child who needs me, a purpose. You think your world is dark, and maybe it is, but I spent 26 years in a different kind of darkness, the kind where no one sees you, where you don't matter to anyone, where you're completely alone. I'm not going back to that." "You could have a normal life," Enzo said, his voice rough, "a safe life." "I could have a lonely life," Victoria corrected. "I could go back to existing instead of living, but I won't. Not when Zadie calls me Mama, not when I finally found people who," her voice broke, "who want me to stay." Enzo crossed the space between them in 3 strides. He stopped just short of touching her, his dark eyes searching her face. "You could have anything, anyone, Why would you choose this? Choose us? Because you're my family, Victoria said simply. Zadie is my daughter in every way that matters. And you, she met his gaze without flinching, you're the first person who's ever fought to keep me safe instead of pushing me away. Something in Enzo's carefully controlled expression finally crumbled. I told myself I would never feel this again. After my wife died, I buried everything. I thought I was incapable of... He stopped, seeming to struggle with words. But you walked into my world and saved my daughter, and somehow, without meaning to, you saved me too. Victoria felt tears burning behind her eyes. So stop trying to send me away. Victoria Kensington, Enzo said, and his hand finally came up to cup her face, his touch gentle despite the violence those hands were capable of. Will you stay? Not because you're bound by family law or obligation, but because you choose to? I choose to stay. I choose you. I choose Zadie. I choose this family. Enzo kissed her then, slow and deep and full of promises neither of them thought they'd ever make again. When they finally pulled apart, Victoria was crying and smiling simultaneously. Papa? Victoria? They turned to find Zadie in the doorway, her eyes wide and hopeful. Come here, Tesoro, Enzo said softly, and Zadie ran to them. He scooped her up, and Victoria wrapped her arms around them both, this broken, dangerous, perfect family they'd built from loss and choice and love. 3 months later, Victoria stood in the garden wearing a dress she'd never imagined owning, surrounded by people who'd become her family. Enzo's mother, who'd welcomed her with tears and Italian blessings. Antonio, who'd grudgingly admitted she had good instincts for a civilian. Maria, who'd known from the beginning that Victoria belonged here.
The ceremony was simple, a formal adoption into the Russo family. Not a marriage, not yet, but something equally binding. A declaration that Victoria Kensington was no longer an outsider. She was family. She was home. Zadie stood beside her in a white dress, holding Victoria's hand, and when the officiant asked if she accepted this bond freely, Victoria looked at Enzo and at the little girl she'd found freezing in an alley and said without hesitation, I do. That night, tucking Zadie into bed, the little girl looked up at her with those enormous dark eyes, no longer haunted, but bright with life and healing. Mama? Zadie whispered. You're never leaving, right? You promise? Victoria smoothed the hair back from Zadie's forehead and smiled. I promise, baby. I'm exactly where I belong. Forever. And for the first time in 26 years, Victoria Kensington believed in forever. Because family wasn't the one you were born into. Family was the one that chose you when you had nothing, and held on to you when you finally had everything.